The ribbon was red, or it had been, once. Now it lay half swallowed by the mud of Dutfield's yard, its colour leached to the shade of old rust, its edges frilled where the water had worked at them through the long, cold hours before dawn. It was perhaps 6 inches long. It smelled of coal smoke and something faintly sweet, violet water, or something trying to be, and it was tied, quite deliberately, into a small and careful bough. That was the first thing Watson noticed. Not the body, not the constable standing white-faced at the yard's entrance, his lantern trembling at the end of his arm like a pendulum that had forgotten how to stop. Not the sound of the city beyond the narrow passage, the slow clop of a cart-horse on Burner Street, the distant sigh of the river, a dog somewhere making its private complaint against the dark. Watson noticed the ribbon because it was wrong, not wrong in the way that everything else in Dutfield's yard was wrong on that particular morning in October of 1888. Wrong in the way that a tidy thing, a careful thing, a thing someone had folded and tied with patient fingers, had absolutely no business being here, in this mud, at this hour. He crouched beside it, did not touch it, simply looked. Behind him, Holmes was already moving, that unhurried, deliberate circuit he made around any scene of interest, hands clasped at the back of his coat, chin slightly dropped, eyes performing their quiet, relentless arithmetic on everything they passed over. He moved like a man reading a room he had already memorized, checking only for the details that had shifted since his last visit, which was, Watson reflected, essentially what he was doing. Holmes had been reading rooms like this one, rooms that happened to be outdoors, that happened to contain human tragedy, for years now. The reading never seemed to cost him anything. Watson was never entirely sure whether to admire that, or find it troubling. The yard was not large. It was the kind of space that exists in London purely by accident, a gap between a working men's club on one side and a row of cottages on the other, connected to the street by a narrow passage barely wide enough for 2 people to pass without turning sideways. During the day it would have been unremarkable. A few barrels, the smell of horses, perhaps a cat asleep on a windowsill. Now, in the last hour before sunrise, with 2 constables holding lanterns at opposite ends, and the fog arranging itself in slow, deliberate layers between the buildings, it had taken on the quality of a stage set. Everything was slightly too still. The light was slightly too golden. The shadows moved when they should not have. Whitechapel in autumn was a neighbourhood that knew how to keep secrets. It had been keeping them for centuries, secrets of the commercial and the criminal, the quietly desperate and the loudly dangerous, all compressed together into streets that had been built without particular plan and maintained without particular care. The houses leaned toward one another overhead as though sharing confidence. The alleyways branched and doubled back. The fog, when it came in from the river, and in October it always came, settled into the low places first, filling the gaps between cobblestones, pooling in doorways, swallowing the lower halves of lamp-posts so that the gas flames appeared to float, unmoored, several feet above the ground. It was the sort of fog that made honest men check behind them and dishonest men feel comfortable. It did not discriminate. It simply softened everything, as fog will, until the city looked like a memory of itself. Watson stood slowly and turned his attention to what he had been professionally required to examine. The victim was a woman, perhaps 40 years of age, though the life lived in Whitechapel had a way of adding years to a face that had nothing to do with the calendar. She lay on her side in the mud beside the near wall of the yard, her dark coat pulled close as though she had arranged herself for sleep. Her expression, and this was a thing Watson noted, with the careful, clinical distance he had spent years constructing, was not one of fear. It was something closer to surprise, the kind of expression that belonged to a moment of sudden and complete incomprehension. She had not, Watson thought, understood what was happening to her. There was some mercy in that, if mercy was the right word for so thin a comfort. The wounds were severe. Watson did not need to examine them closely to understand the general fact of that. But it was in the specific examination that his unease began to take a shape he could not quite name. He said nothing for a moment, simply looked. There was a particular quality to violence, in Watson's experience, that revealed the nature of the person who had committed it, not always the identity, but the character. A domestic argument that had passed its limit left marks of a certain kind. A robbery gone wrong left marks of another. And what Watson had read, in his time, about the killings that had been occurring in Whitechapel over recent weeks, the killings the newspapers were covering with a breathless, lurid energy that seemed only barely concealing its enjoyment. Those had a quality of frenzy to them, of escalation, of something that had moved beyond intention into impulse. These wounds did not feel like that. They were severe. He would not minimize them. But there was and here Watson paused, searching for the correct word, because the correct word mattered when you were trying to think clearly, a precision to them. Not the precision of the practiced surgeon, necessarily, but the precision of someone who had known, in advance, more or less what they intended to do, and had done it. There was no hesitation in the pattern, no correction, no evidence of the wild, escalating energy that the newspapers had described in their dramatic reconstructions of the earlier crimes. Watson straightened. He became aware that Holmes was standing beside him, and had been for some time. "You see it?" Holmes said. It was not a question. "Something," Watson said carefully. "I'm not certain what I see, precisely." "Precisely is exactly right," Holmes said. He crouched where Watson had crouched, though his attention was not on the wounds, but on the ground immediately surrounding. The body, on the specific distribution of the mud, on the way the grass at the yard's edge had been pressed flat in certain places and not others. Precisely is the word. Tell me, Watson, when a large dog attacks a small animal, what does the aftermath look like? Watson considered this. Disordered, scattered, evidence of movement, of struggle, of chaos, Holmes said. Yes, and here. Watson looked again. The body was, and this was the thing, the specific thing that had been sitting at the edge of his awareness since he had first entered the yard. Positioned. Not arranged exactly, but positioned, as though she had fallen in a particular direction with a particular force, and then remained exactly where she had landed. There was no scattering, no trail of disturbance leading back from the body toward the passage. The mud around her was marked, certainly. Boot prints, the constable's primarily, and a single set, leading inward from the passage, that the first officer on scene had carefully avoided disturbing. But the wider yard was undisturbed. She was not chased, Watson said. She was not chased, Holmes agreed. He rose and his gaze moved back toward the entrance of the yard. Then, with the particular quality of attention that Watson had learned to mark, the slight sharpening of something behind the eyes, he moved toward the wall to the left of the passage entrance. Watson followed. The wall was brick, old and damp, with a ledge at roughly waist height, where the masonry had been patched and had settled unevenly. On this ledge, resting in the shelter of a slight overhang that had kept it from the worst of the night's damp, there was a small, flat object. A square of card, perhaps. No. Watson saw, leaning closer, a folded piece of paper. The fold was tight and deliberate. The paper itself was of reasonable quality, not the paper of poverty. The paper of someone who bought their stationery from a shop that had a name. Holmes did not touch it immediately. He studied it for a moment with his hands still clasped at his back. Placed, not dropped, he said quietly. The ledge is dry beneath it, which tells us it was placed after the rain stopped. So within the last 3 hours. The fold points outward toward the yard, toward anyone standing at this position. He paused. Which is to say, toward whoever came to look. Placed for someone to find, Watson said. Placed for someone specific to find, Holmes said. Or perhaps for anyone. And the someone specific is whoever placed it. In either case, it was meant to be here. This is not a thing dropped in flight. He produced a handkerchief from his pocket, wrapped it carefully around his fingers, and lifted the folded paper. Did not open it. Simply turned it over once, examined both sides, and placed it into his coat pocket with a precise, unhurried motion. "We will look at this at home," he said. "In better light. With tea." Watson almost smiled at that. The two of them, standing in a murder yard in the fog before sunrise, and Holmes spoke of tea as though it were the obvious and necessary next step, which, Watson reflected, it probably was. He took one more look at the scene, at the constables with their lanterns, at the fog thickening slightly as the temperature dropped in that particular way it did in the hour before the city began to wake, at the mud, at the dark shape against the wall, at the ribbon. "Holmes," he said. Holmes turned. "The ribbon?" Watson nodded toward it. "It's tied into a bow." Holmes looked at it for a long moment. Long enough that Watson began to think he had already registered it and moved past it, that the ribbon was a piece of data already filed and annotated in whatever extraordinary internal architecture Holmes used to organize the world. But then Holmes said, very quietly, almost to himself, "Yes, it is, isn't it?" And there was something in his voice that Watson could not quite identify. Not surprise. Holmes was rarely surprised by individual facts, only by the patterns they formed. Not concern, or not only concern. Something that might have been, in a man less guarded, the very earliest edge of unease. He did not explain it. He simply turned and walked toward the passage, his footsteps quiet on the cobbles, the fog closing around him in the manner of a curtain. Watson looked at the ribbon one last time. A red bow in Dutfield's yard, tied by careful fingers, belonging to no one who was still alive to claim it. A tidy thing in an untidy place, a careful thing in a careless darkness. He followed Holmes out into Berner Street. The city was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to wake. The sky above the rooftops was no longer purely black. It had shifted toward that particular shade of dark blue that preceded dawn in London, a colour that suggested the night was loosening its grip without quite admitting it. On the corner, A coffee stall had opened early, its proprietor moving in, the efficient, unhurried manner of a man who had been doing the same thing at the same hour for 30 years, and saw no reason to vary the rhythm now. The smell of it drifted across the street, strong, dark, slightly bitter, and mixed with the coal smoke and the river damp and the vague, complicated scent of a city that never fully slept. A hansom cab was waiting at Holmes's signal at the end of the street. Watson climbed in, and for a moment, before Holmes followed, he paused on the pavement and looked back down Berner Street, at the fog, at the glow of the constables' lanterns just visible at the yard's entrance, at the ordinary, indifferent life of the neighbourhood beginning to stir around a place where something terrible had happened. Holmes climbed in. The cab moved. "Tell me what you observed," Holmes said. Not what Watson had seen, what he had observed. The distinction was always deliberate. Watson settled back against the seat, listening to the horse's slow rhythm. On the cobbles, watching the gas lamps slide past one by one through the cab window, each one a small, patient circle of gold in the grey. He began, in the careful, methodical way he had learned to value over years of partnership with a man who valued it most, to describe what he had seen, the ribbon and its bow, the paper on the ledge, the quality of the wounds, their specificity, their lack of the escalating frenzy the newspapers had attributed to the killer the city had already named the Whitechapel Monster, or, in the more excitable publications, something older and darker still, something that walked on two legs but was not entirely a man. Holmes listened without interrupting. This, too, Watson had learned to value. Holmes was the finest listener he had ever known, which was something people who knew Holmes only from his reputation frequently found surprising. But listening was the foundation of everything. You could not reason correctly from insufficient data, and you could not gather data if you were talking. Outside, London moved. A dray horse leaned into its collar. A woman in a grey shawl stood in a doorway and watched the cab pass with the expression of someone who had long since stopped being curious about the comings and goings of strangers. The fog thinned slightly as they moved north and west, away from the river, though it did not disappear. It never entirely disappeared in October, merely shifted texture, from the thick and enveloping kind to the thin, drifting kind that caught in the tops of the elms in the parks and made the city look, in the early morning, like something painted in watercolour by someone who had not quite decided where the edges should be. "The wounds," Holmes said finally, when Watson had finished. "You said precise." "Purposeful," Watson said, as though the person who caused them had a specific intention, not frenzy, not the loss of control the newspapers describe. "The newspapers," Holmes said, in a tone that conveyed with considerable economy his opinion of the newspapers. "There is a particular quality," Watson continued, "to wounds inflicted by someone in the grip of violent, uncontrolled emotion. I have seen it before, in my time as a physician. This was not that." "No," Holmes said, "it was not." He was quiet for a moment. The cab turned onto Commercial Street, and the sounds changed. More traffic, even at this hour. The clop of hooves on better-maintained road, the distant whistle of an early train. "Watson," he said, "what do you know about animal blood transfusions?" Watson turned to look at him. Holmes was watching the street outside the window, his profile still and unreadable in the grey light. "Very little," Watson said slowly. "It has been experimented with, I believe. The results are not generally considered to be. Holmes, why?" But Holmes had already looked away. The cab was pulling up before the familiar door on Baker Street, and Mrs. Hudson was... No, that was impossible. Surely she was not already awake, and yet the light in the kitchen was lit, warm and yellow. And if Watson knew anything after all these years, it was that wherever he and Holmes returned from, whatever hour the return might occur, there would be tea. He climbed out into the early morning, the fog thin and patient around him, and followed Holmes through the door. The ribbon's image stayed with him as he climbed the stairs. Red and rust-coloured, carefully tied. Someone's fingers, somewhere, pressing the loops into that careful bow. A small, deliberate thing left behind in the dark. He did not yet know what it meant, but he had learned, over many years, to trust the feeling of a detail that would not let go. It meant something. It always did. Baker Street at that hour existed in a world of its own making. The rest of London was beginning, cautiously, to resume its daily business. The bakers already at their ovens, the early workers moving through the streets, with their collars up and their eyes on the pavement, the milk carts making their deliberate rounds with a sound of wheels and clanking that was, in its own way, as reliable as church bells. But 221B Baker Street seemed, as it so often did, to occupy a slightly different relationship with time than the buildings around it. It was never quite in a hurry. It was never quite asleep. It existed in a permanent middle state, warm and alert, and slightly outside the ordinary rhythm of the world, like a man reading at a window while a crowd moves past below. Mrs. Hudson had, as Watson had suspected, been awake. She had also, as Watson had known she would be, produced tea without being asked, a full pot, correctly steeped, with the particular quiet efficiency that was her most remarkable quality. She had looked at them both as they came through the door, taken in, with a single practised glance, the mud on Watson's boots and the focused stillness of Holmes's expression, and said only, "I'll bring it up directly. No questions, no commentary." Watson had always considered this one of the more underappreciated forms of human kindness. The sitting-room received them as it always did, with the comfortable disorder of a space that had been lived in thoroughly and without apology. Holmes's papers covered the table nearest the window. A chemical experiment of indeterminate vintage occupied the corner by the mantelpiece, its glassware clouded with some residue Holmes had not yet seen fit to explain. Books were distributed across every horizontal surface, with a logic that was presumably apparent to Holmes and opaque to everyone else. The fire had been banked, but not let out, and when Holmes crouched before the grate and coaxed it back into life, a task he performed with the same focused economy he brought to everything, the room shifted almost immediately, from merely warm to genuinely welcoming. The light changed. The shadows pulled back. The ceiling became, briefly, golden. Watson sat in his chair. He did not speak. There was a particular kind of exhaustion that came not from physical exertion, but from having been, for a sustained period, in the presence of something terrible. A careful, low-grade wearing down of the nerves that expressed itself not as tiredness exactly, but as a desire for stillness. He was grateful for the fire. He was grateful for the chair. He was grateful, in the particular way of a man who has spent enough years in dangerous places to understand the value of the opposite for the complete and utter ordinariness of a sitting room at dawn. Holmes settled at the table. He produced the folded paper from his coat pocket and placed it, still unread, before him. Then he produced the handkerchief he had used to handle it, folded it precisely, and set it to one side. Then he sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table, looking at the folded paper, not touching it, simply looking. In the way that Watson had come to understand was, not inaction, but its opposite. Holmes' thinking looked to the uninformed observer very much like Holmes doing nothing. It was one of his more misleading qualities. Mrs. Hudson arrived with the tray, set it down without a word, departed. The clock on the mantelpiece, which had opinions about every quarter hour and expressed them without fail, confirmed that it was 20 minutes past 5 in the morning. Watson poured the tea, set Holmes's cup at his elbow. Holmes did not acknowledge it, but his hand moved to it with the automatic accuracy of long habit, and he drank without looking up. Then he unfolded the paper. It was, Watson saw from across the table, a page torn from something, a ledger, perhaps, or an account book. The paper was ruled in the faint blue lines of a commercial document, and across it, in columns that had once presumably contained neat rows of figures, someone had made additional notations in a different hand, a darker ink, a more hurried script, though not, Watson noted, even from this distance, a careless one, the hand of someone writing quickly, but someone who had been educated to write well. The two things were not the same. Holmes studied it in silence. His expression did not change. But then, Holmes's expression very rarely changed in ways that meant what they appeared to mean. The stillness of his face was not blankness. It was concentration expressed in the absence of anything else. On the page's upper corner, embossed rather than written, was a small seal, circular, cracked across its lower half in a way that suggested the embossing plate had been damaged at some point, dropped, perhaps, or simply worn, so that the image it produced was incomplete. Watson could make out the suggestion of a design within the circle, something with a vertical element, and what might have been a banner or a ribbon of text around the edge. But the crack had taken the lower portion of whatever the text said, and the upper portion was too faint and too small to read clearly from where he sat. Holmes set the paper down, picked up his tea, looked at the fire. 3 entries, he said. Dates in September, running to the end of the month. Each entry records a payment. Amounts are not large, but are consistent, which suggests regularity rather than improvisation. The column heading, where there should be a name or a category, has been deliberately overwritten. Someone went back and scribbled over it. Not torn out, not blotted. Scribbled, which is interesting. Tearing suggests panic. Blotting suggests preparation. Scribbling suggests irritation. He paused. Or haste combined with irritation, which is a specific and rather revealing emotional state. Watson leaned forward slightly. And the seal? Damaged, Holmes said, but not recently. The crack is consistent across all 3 embossed impressions, which means the plate was already broken when this document was produced. Someone continued using a broken seal, rather than replacing it. He set his cup down. Which tells us several things, none of them individually conclusive, but collectively suggestive. Such as that whoever produced this document was either too busy or too disinclined to obtain a new seal, which implies either significant demands on their time, a professional with a heavy schedule, or a certain carelessness about appearances, or both. Holmes rose and moved to the window. The street below was grey and still, the gas lamps still lit against the not quite dawn, their light reflected in the damp cobblestones in long, wavering lines. The paper itself is interesting, good quality, not the paper of a man with no means, but it has been stored somewhere damp. The fibres have relaxed slightly. A cellar, perhaps, or a lower ground room with insufficient ventilation. He turned from the window. "Someone placed this paper on that ledge in Dutfield's yard," he said, "after the rain stopped, and before the body was discovered. They knew there would be people examining that yard. They intended this to be found." A pause. The question, as always, is by whom? The fire crackled. Outside, very faintly, the first birds of the morning were beginning to register their opinions about the approaching light. Watson drank his tea and felt the warmth of it move through him slowly, the way warmth does when you have been cold for a long time without fully noticing it. "The newspapers," Watson said after a moment, "will say this is the same man." "The newspapers," Holmes said, with that same careful economy, "will say it is the same beast. They have stopped calling him a man." He moved to the table and picked up 3 newspapers that Watson had not previously noticed, the editions from the evening before, or the day before that, their headlines visible even from where Watson sat. Large black type. Exclamation points, which Watson had always considered a sign of insufficient confidence in the actual news. The monster of Whitechapel, the Whitechapel fiend. And, from a paper that had apparently decided subtlety was a commercial disadvantage. Is it a man? Holmes spread them across the table and stood looking down at them with an expression Watson could only describe as clinical distaste. 3 separate witnesses, Holmes said, have told the police that they observed, on the night in question, a large figure moving through the streets of Whitechapel with, and I quote from the account given to the inspector, "a rolling, unnatural gait, broad across the shoulders, bent forward at the neck as a beast goes, with something dark about the lower face." He looked up. 3 witnesses, 3 separate occasions, 3 separate streets. Consistent accounts, Watson offered, cautiously. Consistent accounts, Holmes agreed, which is either evidence that they all saw the same thing, or evidence that the second and third witnesses had read the account of the first. He let that settle. Fear is a remarkable force, Watson. It does not require facts in order to propagate. It requires only a shape, something half-seen, something that matches an existing anxiety. Give people a shape to be afraid of, and they will begin to see it everywhere. In doorways, in the fog, in the bent back of a man hurrying home against the cold. He sat down. The city has been given a shape. The newspapers have refined it. By next week, every large man in Whitechapel who walks with his collar up will have been reported to someone. Watson considered this. He thought of the wounds in Dutfield's yard, the specific, purposeful quality he had not been able to name at the time, but which sat with him still, even here in the warmth of Baker Street, like a splinter just below the skin. The wounds weren't made by a man acting without control, he said. No. They were made by someone who knew what they were doing. Yes. Holmes picked up the ledger page again and turned it once more in his hands. Someone who understood the human body in a specific, applicable way, not simply as a target, as an object of study. He set the page down again. The injury pattern is consistent with someone who had reason to know where to cut and how to cut there. The weapon, whatever it was not improvised. And yet, he paused. And yet, Watson prompted. And yet, the cuts are not surgical. They are not the cuts of a man who stood at an operating table. They are wilder than that. As though someone with a surgeon's knowledge had applied it through a surgeon's hands, but under circumstances that were not surgical. He frowned at the fire. As though the knowledge were present, but the control were diminished, or deliberately obscured. A performance of wildness over a foundation of precision. The clock on the mantelpiece marked the half-hour. The fire shifted and settled. Outside, London was fully waking now. The sounds had changed from the solitary and random to the continuous, the layered noise of a city resuming its ordinary life above the extraordinary event that had occurred in a yard off Berner Street, which most of its citizens did not yet know about, but would, by the time the afternoon editions arrived, know about in considerable and luridly enhanced detail. Watson thought about what Holmes had said the previous night, in the cab, in the last moments before Baker Street. The question about animal blood transfusions. He had not pressed it then. The time had not seemed right. They had been too close to Dutfield's yard, and some questions want a little distance before they can be asked properly. "Last night," Watson said, "in the cab, you mentioned animal blood." Holmes looked at him. Not with surprise. Holmes was rarely caught off guard by a question he had himself introduced, but with the particular attention of someone deciding how much to say. "It has been attempted," Holmes said carefully. "You will know the experiments better than I. Blood from one animal introduced into the veins of another, or of a man. The results have been various, in most cases catastrophic. The body rejects what is foreign to it. The patient becomes febrile. The temperature rises. There may be perceptual disturbances, hallucinations. In extreme cases, violent episodes. The physiology is not fully understood, but the symptoms have been documented." Watson was very still. "You are describing," he said slowly, "a man who would appear to a witness to be not himself, who would move strangely, who might make sounds, who might—" He stopped. He thought of the accounts in the newspapers, the rolling, unnatural gait, the darkness about the lower face, something dark and wet. "Holmes, I am not yet certain," Holmes said. "I am, considering a possibility. The ledger page, the payments. Someone is paying for something, regularly, in September, in Whitechapel. Someone with access to a damaged seal. Good quality paper stored in a damp room. Someone with sufficient knowledge of human anatomy to stage a scene that looks, to the eyes of frightened witnesses and excitable newspapers, like the work of something other than a man." He paused. "And sufficient motive to want that impression created and maintained." "What motive?" Watson asked. Holmes looked at the ledger page. "The oldest one," he said. "Money, and the fear of people who are afraid is remarkably easy to monetize, if one has no particular objection to the method." The ribbon sat on the edge of the table, where Watson had placed it. He had taken it, finally, from the mud, wrapped in his own handkerchief, almost without deciding to. It was a small thing, rust red, carefully tied. He looked at it now, and thought of the fingers that had tied it. whether those fingers had belonged to the woman in the yard or to someone else entirely, whether the bow was an act of vanity or of grief or of deliberate calculated theatre, he did not yet know. But the ribbon was there, on the table in Baker Street, in the growing morning light, and it was not going to let him go. He had learned, after many years, to pay attention to the things that would not let him go. Holmes was already reaching for a second newspaper. The case had begun, quietly, in lamplight, over tea, to resolve itself into a shape. Not clearly, not yet. But the edges were beginning to define themselves, the way the city's rooftops defined themselves against the sky as the light strengthened, emerging from the dark one at a time, patient and inevitable. Outside, the gas lamps went out, one by one, as the morning took over from the night. Inside, the fire burned steadily, and the clock measured the silence between facts, and Holmes read, and Watson sat with a rust-red ribbon and the beginning of a thought he could not yet finish. The fog had not lifted by mid-morning. This was not, in October, unusual. London's fog had its own opinions about schedules, and kept none of them reliably. It arrived when it chose, departed when it felt like it, and in the intervening hours conducted itself with the self-possession of a guest who has decided, without consulting anyone, to stay indefinitely. By the time Holmes and Watson descended to Baker Street and found a cab willing to take them east, the fog had settled into the particular mid-morning variety, not the thick, blinding kind of the small hours, but a thin, persistent haze that softened every edge and gave the city the quality of a watercolour painting left out in damp weather. The buildings were present, but imprecise. The people on the pavements moved through it like figures in a dream, appearing and disappearing with a casualness that suggested they had long since made their peace with being intermittently invisible. Whitechapel received them as it always did, without ceremony and without apology. There was a quality to the neighbourhood that Watson had never quite been able to articulate to anyone who had not spent time in it. It was not simply poverty, though poverty was certainly present in the particular way it manifested in the East End, in the worn-down heels and the careful mending of coats that had been mended one time too many, in the faces of women who had the expression of people doing complicated arithmetic in their heads at all hours of the day. It was something more than that. It was a kind of compressed vitality, the energy of a great many people, living in a small space, rubbing against each other and against the city, and against the daily difficulty of simply being alive, and producing from that friction something that was not quite despair, and not quite resilience, but some third quality that had no satisfactory name. The streets were loud even when they were quiet. The silence between the sounds was never empty. The London hospital sat on Whitechapel Road with the solidity of an institution that had been there long enough to stop feeling obliged to justify itself. Its facade was plain brick, practical and unapologetic, with the look of a building that had been designed by someone whose primary concern was the accommodation of function rather than the impression of elegance, which was, Watson supposed, the correct set of priorities for a hospital. The carriage entrance on the east side was already busy, a steady, quiet movement of people arriving and departing that had the quality of a tide rather than a crowd, rhythmic and purposeful, and without obvious beginning or end. Holmes paid the cab and stood for a moment on the pavement, looking up at the building's facade with the expression of a man making calculations. "We are here," he said, "in an unofficial capacity." "We are frequently in an unofficial capacity," Watson said, "more unofficial than usual. Inspector Lestrade has, as of this morning, officially attributed last night's events to the same perpetrator as the previous Whitechapel killings, and has communicated to the press that the investigation is proceeding along established lines." Holmes paused. "This means he is looking for a large, violent man with no particular medical knowledge and a taste for dramatic exits. He is not looking here." "And we are." "We are looking," Holmes said, "at a possibility. Nothing more at present." He adjusted his coat and moved toward the entrance. "We are visiting a colleague of yours, Watson. That is all anyone needs to know." This was not entirely untrue. Watson did know the hospital. He had done part of his training here, in the chaotic and educational fashion of a young medical man learning that the gap between theory and practice was approximately the size of a teaching hospital on a busy Monday. He knew several of the senior physicians still on staff. More relevantly, he knew the name of the man whose department occupied the East Wing's lower floor, a Dr. Clarence Vane, who had been a year ahead of Watson at his medical school, and who had, in the intervening years, developed a particular research interest in the properties of blood. Watson had not seen Vane in several years. He remembered him as a capable, driven man, the kind of physician whose ambition slightly outpaced his bedside manner, who spoke about his patients with the precise, detached vocabulary of someone whose primary relationship was with the problem rather than the person presenting it. Not an unkind man, Watson had always thought, but a man for whom kindness was, in practice, somewhat beside the point. They found him in his office on the lower corridor, which smelled of carbolic acid and old paper, and something else beneath those, something with a faint animal warmth that Watson's nose registered before his mind did, the way smells sometimes communicated ahead of conscious thought. Vane was at his desk when they entered, writing in a small, cramped hand across a sheaf of papers, and he looked up with the brief, calibrating expression of a man who has been interrupted and is deciding in real time whether the interruption is worth acknowledging. He recognized Watson after a moment. His expression shifted, not to warmth, precisely, but to something in that direction. "Watson?" he said. "It has been some time." "It has," Watson agreed. He introduced Holmes, describing him as a consulting colleague, which was not inaccurate. Vane's gaze moved to Holmes, with a particular assessment of an intelligent man encountering another intelligent man and taking the measure of him, quickly, without appearing to. "I won't keep you," Holmes said pleasantly. "Watson has a patient he wished to follow up on, a referral some weeks ago from a clinic in this district. We won't need to trouble you directly." Vane looked at Watson. Watson produced, from memory, and a small piece of prior consultation with Holmes in the cab, a name. A first name only. John, which was a name that covered a considerable amount of London. Description. A labouring man, perhaps 35, referred for treatment of febrile episodes of sudden onset, occasional violent confusion. Something moved across Vane's face. Very briefly, the way a reflection moves across still water when something passes overhead, present and then not present, leaving the surface undisturbed but with the definite sense that something had passed. "I would need to check the admissions ledger," Vane said, after a moment that was slightly too long. "Of course," Watson said. Vane rose, moved to the door, and called for an orderly. While they waited, Holmes drifted, in the manner of a man with nothing particular in mind, toward the shelves along the far wall. They were loaded, as the shelves of a research physician generally are, with the specific and varied accumulation of a working career. Bound journals, specimen jars, a number of small notebooks stacked horizontally, and, at the far end, a row of glass-stopped vials in a wooden rack, each labelled in Vane's cramped script. Watson watched Holmes look at them. Holmes did not touch them. He simply looked and then looked away, as though he had seen nothing of particular interest, which Watson had learned to read as meaning precisely the opposite. The orderly arrived, was dispatched to the admissions records. While Vane's attention was on the door, Holmes said conversationally, "Interesting research area, Dr. Vane. Blood properties. I imagine the clinical applications are considerable." Vane turned. "Potentially," he said. The word was carefully neutral. "The transfusion work, heterologous experiments, I believe the literature calls them. Animal to human. There have been some remarkable results reported from the continent." "Remarkable is one word for them," Vane said. His tone had changed very slightly, a tightening, like a string tuned up a half step. Not alarmed, but attentive. "The results are generally understood to be negative, in clinical terms. The rejection response is severe. I wouldn't characterize the continental work as a model for anything." "Quite," Holmes said pleasantly. "And yet the mechanism of the rejection itself is fascinating, isn't it? The physiological response, the febrile stage, the perceptual disturbances. I imagine, from a purely research perspective, there's considerable—" "Mr. Holmes," Vane said. Holmes stopped. The two men looked at each other across the room for a moment. The corridor outside was quiet, the orderly's footsteps fading toward the records room. The fog pressed against the single window of the office, softening the light from outside to a thin, even grey. "I am a physician," Vane said, "not a research curiosity. If you have specific questions about my work, I would ask you to make them specific." "Of course," Holmes said. The pleasantness in his voice had not diminished at all. "I apologize. A professional habit. The mind wanders toward interesting problems." The orderly returned. There was, it transpired, no record of a patient matching Watson's description in the admissions ledger for the past month. Vane delivered this information with the composed courtesy of a man who has just won a small, quiet point. They thanked him. They left. In the corridor, Watson said nothing. He followed Holmes through the hospital's lower passage, past the dispensary, past a ward where a nurse moved between beds with the quiet efficiency of long practice, her shoes making no sound on the scrubbed floor, and out through a side entrance into a small courtyard that smelled of damp stone and the particular institutional cleanliness of a place that was cleaned thoroughly and often because it needed to be. Holmes stopped in the courtyard. "The vials," Watson said. "Yes." "What were they?" Holmes was quiet for a moment. A pigeon landed on the courtyard wall, regarded them with the philosophical disinterest of a pigeon, and departed. "Several things I recognized," Holmes said. "Morphine, derivatives. A preparation I associate with stimulant compounds. The bottle was the right color and size. And 3 vials at the end of the rack with labels written in a different hand than the rest." He paused. "And the smell in that room, Watson. You noticed it." Watson had noticed it. He had noticed it when they entered and had filed it away without examining it. The way you sometimes filed things away and then found them waiting for you when you went looking. It was the smell of a stable, not strongly, not overtly, but present. That particular warm, organic note beneath the carbolic and the paper, the unmistakable biological reality of an animal in an enclosed space. Not a large animal, not recently, but present. There should be no reason, Watson said slowly, for an office in a teaching hospital to smell of animals. No, Holmes said, there should not. The fog moved through the courtyard in slow drifts, and Watson stood in it and felt the particular unease of a man who has confirmed something he had half hoped would not be confirmed. The theory Holmes had raised in the cab the night before, animal blood, stimulants, manufactured frenzy, had been, at Baker Street, a hypothesis. Interesting, alarming in implication, but still at the stage where it could be set aside as possible, rather than probable. It was becoming harder to set aside. "We need to go back," Watson said. "We need to—" "Not yet." Holmes was looking toward the hospital's rear entrance. "There is one more thing. The patient you described, the symptoms you invented for Vane's benefit, febrile episodes, violent confusion, sudden onset." He turned. "I did not invent them entirely. I had them from a report. A man was brought to a police station in Stepney 3 weeks ago, in a state the desk sergeant described as, and again I quote, as though he did not know himself, sir, nor where he was, and when we tried to calm him, he was more than 3 men's work." He paused. "The man was released the following morning. He remembered nothing. His name was recorded, and then the page was not torn out, not blotted." Watson looked at him. "Scribbled over," Holmes said quietly. The courtyard held its silence around them. Somewhere in the hospital above, a bell sounded, one of the ward bells, a clean single note that meant something routine and necessary was occurring, that the ordinary work of keeping people alive was continuing, as it always continued, indifferent to the fog and the ribbons and the ledger pages and the smell of something that should not have been there. Watson thought of the trembling man, the man who had been 3 men's work to hold, who had woken the next morning with no memory of the night before, in a police cell in Stepney, his hands shaking, his eyes— the desk sergeant had mentioned this, Holmes said, in the same report, his eyes a strange colour in the gaslight. Yellow, the sergeant had written, and then apparently thought better of it and crossed it out, because yellow was not a colour that a man's eyes were, and there had to be a reasonable explanation. There was a reasonable explanation. Watson was standing in a hospital courtyard with the beginning of it, and it was not comforting at all. "Holmes," he said. "I know," Holmes said. They stood in the fog together, the 2 of them, while London went about its morning around them. The ledger had a smell. Watson noticed it that evening when Holmes spread it open on the table under the better light of the sitting-room lamp. A smell of damp, yes, as Holmes had said, but beneath that, something else. Something with a faint chemical note, sharp and slightly sweet, the kind of smell that attached itself to paper stored near certain compounds. Watson knew it from his hospital years. It was the smell of a room where preparations were made. Holmes had obtained the ledger, the full ledger, not merely the torn page, through methods he did not explain, and Watson did not ask about, having learned over many years that the gap between Holmes's methods and the strict letter of legality was occasionally narrow and always navigable, and that asking about it in advance was less useful than simply being present for the results. The ledger was small, bound in dark cloth that had once been black, and was now the colour of old charcoal, its spine cracked along the top third in the manner of a book that had been opened flat too many times in the same place. Someone had consulted it repeatedly. Someone had needed to refer back to it. The entries ran from July through to the end of September. Holmes read them in silence, with Watson at his shoulder, and the fire behind them, and the rain, which had arrived sometime in the middle of the afternoon with the quiet inevitability of a creditor who has been patient long enough, making its steady commentary against the window glass. The entries were, on the surface, unremarkable. Dates, amounts, brief notations in the abbreviated shorthand of a man who expected only himself to read them. But Holmes read shorthand the way other men read plain English, and after 20 minutes of silence he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling with the expression of someone assembling a structure from pieces that had, until this moment, been arranged face down. 7 payments, he said. July through September, irregular intervals, but consistent amounts. Each payment recorded against the same notation, 2 letters, partially overwritten, but the underlying impression is visible if you look at the paper from an angle. He held the ledger toward the lamp, tilting it. WP, a name or an abbreviation. A project, perhaps, or a location. The amounts are not large. We are not talking about the sums that change a man's life. We are talking about the sums that maintain a small, regular operation. Equipment, materials, perhaps a modest payment to someone whose silence or assistance has been arranged. Someone in Whitechapel, Watson said. Someone in Whitechapel, or someone with regular business there. The damp in the paper is consistent with storage in the area east of the hospital. The river influence becomes apparent in the paper fibres below Aldgate, broadly speaking. This is not a document that spent its life in Mayfair. Holmes set the ledger down. The payments stop at the end of September, which is when the incidents began. Watson moved to his own chair and sat with the particular care of a man whose body is reminding him that he has not slept properly in some time. The rain said its piece against the window. The fire shifted and breathed. From somewhere below, the smell of Mrs. Hudson's kitchen, something with onions and stock, something with the specific civilizing power of food prepared without urgency, drifted up through the house in the way that good domestic smells do, occupying the background with a warmth that asked nothing of the foreground. The payments stop, Watson said, and the incidents begin. The operation moved from preparation to execution, Holmes said. Whatever was being funded in those months, materials, trials, the arrangements I mentioned, was ready by October, or was required to be ready by October, for reasons we do not yet know. Watson thought about this. He thought about Vane's office and the smell of something animal beneath the carbolic. He thought about the vials in the rack with their labels in a different hand. He thought about the man in Stepney, the man who had been 3 men's work, who had woken the next morning with nothing but shaking hands and no memory, whose record had been scribbled over by someone who had access to a police station's records, and a reason to prefer that particular page be illegible. The protection payments, Watson said. You mentioned that in Baker Street. That fear was easy to monetize. Holmes nodded slowly. He was looking at the fire now, with the distant, focused quality that meant his mind was several steps ahead of his eyes. Whitechapel has a well-established economy of fear. It has had one for a long time. There are individuals and organizations in that neighborhood whose income derives directly from the anxieties of the people living there. A woman running a lodging house pays a weekly sum to someone who ensures her lodgers are not troubled. A market trader pays to ensure his stall is not overturned. The mechanisms are informal, unrecorded, and entirely real. He paused. Now introduce into that neighborhood, into a city already trembling with newspaper-amplified anxiety, a series of attacks that appear to be the work of something inhuman, something that cannot be stopped by the usual means, something that the police cannot find because they do not know what they are looking for. And then offer protection from it, Watson said quietly. And then offer protection from it, Holmes agreed. Not loudly, not publicly, but in the way these things are offered in Whitechapel, person to person, neighborhood to neighborhood. A word from someone credible. I can keep you safe. The others who paid are safe. The ones who did not. He gestured toward the newspapers still spread on the table. The beast does not discriminate, unless, of course, it does. The rain intensified briefly, drumming against the glass with sudden energy, and then subsided again to its earlier steadiness. The clock measured the silence in its usual precise fashion. Watson reached into his coat pocket. He had been carrying the key since the hospital courtyard. The small plain key he had found folded inside the ledger's pages and had not yet mentioned to Holmes, for reasons he was still working out. It was an ordinary key. Small, brass, the kind cut for a cabinet or a document box rather than a door. Its bow was plain, without ornamentation. It had been used. The bit was worn, in the manner of a key that had turned. The same lock many times. He set it on the table. Holmes looked at it, then looked at Watson. The ledger's pages, Watson said, folded inside, near the back. I noticed it in the courtyard, and I'm not sure why I didn't mention it immediately. I think I needed to consider it first. Holmes said nothing about the delay. He simply picked the key up and held it under the lamp, turning it with the same unhurried focus he brought to everything. Cabinet lock, he said. The wear pattern suggests frequent use. The brass has been handled enough that the surface is slightly burnished here. He indicated a point on the shaft, which means it was carried regularly in a pocket or a small case, and removed and replaced often enough to produce that specific wear. This is not a key kept on a hook. It is a key kept on a person. He set it down, or kept inside a ledger that was itself kept close. Kept close, Watson said, by whoever placed the ledger page in Dutfield's yard. Which returns us, Holmes said, to the question of what that person wanted us to find. Outside, London was conducting its evening. The rain brought people indoors earlier than usual, and the streets below had taken on the particular nighttime quiet of a wet autumn evening. Not silent, never silent, but reduced to the essential sounds. A cab, a distant shout, the steady percussion of water in the gutters. The gas lamps were lit, their light softened and scattered by the rain into wide, impressionistic halos that turned the wet pavement into something almost beautiful, if you were looking at it from a warm room with tea. Watson was looking at it from a warm room with tea. He thought of Whitechapel in this same rain. The lodging houses with their narrow beds and their coal smoke warmth. The public houses doing their steady trade, the frosted glass of their windows glowing amber from inside, the sound of voices and movement just audible from the street. The women moving quickly with their shawls pulled close, not looking up, not stopping. The men coming off late shifts, heads down, boots loud on the wet cobbles. An ordinary neighbourhood doing the ordinary things a neighbourhood does at the end of an ordinary day, except that it was not ordinary, and had not been since the first attack. And every person moving through those streets was carrying, along with whatever else they carried, the specific weight of being afraid, in a place that had given them no way to put it down. That, Watson thought, was the true crime. Before the ledger, before the payments, before whatever Vane was doing in his damp-smelling office with his unlabelled vials and his covered-over records, the true crime was the deliberate manufacture of that fear. The decision made by someone with sufficient intelligence to know exactly what they were doing, to take a neighbourhood already worn thin and stretch it further, to take people who were already managing the daily difficulty of poverty and uncertainty, and add to that difficulty the specific, formless terror of something that could not be reasoned with or avoided or understood. He said as much to Holmes. Holmes listened. He did not look away from the fire. "Yes," he said, when Watson had finished, "that is precisely right. And it is why, when this is over, the resolution must be managed carefully." He paused. "The fear doesn't end when the source of the fear is removed. That is not how it works. The city has been told a shape. The shape will persist for some time after the man who drew it is no longer drawing. People will continue to see it in doorways and in the fog, because once you have been given a shape to be afraid of, the mind does not simply discard it. It files it. It keeps it available." Watson looked at the cracked seal on the ledger's cover, visible now that the book lay open, the embossed circle with its damaged lower half, the incomplete text around its edge. He had been thinking about it intermittently since Baker Street, turning it over in the way you turned over a word you almost recognized. The sense of familiarity without resolution, the feeling that the answer was present but not yet accessible. "The seal," he said. "Holmes, have you identified it?" Holmes reached into his coat and produced a small piece of paper. A rubbing, Watson realized, made at some point he had not observed. The embossed impression transferred to the paper in pencil with the patient precision of a man who had done this before. He held it under the lamp. The circle, the vertical element at the centre, a column, Watson now saw, or a pillar. The banner of text around the edge, upper portion illegible, lower lost to the crack. What he could read was Collegium, and then 3 or 4 letters, and then the crack took the rest. A collegiate or guild seal, Holmes said, medical given the context. The pillar is a common element in the heraldry of medical institutions, associated with stability, foundation, the physician's enduring obligation. The full text is obscured, but the upper portion gives us enough to identify the general class of institution. He set the rubbing down. There are not many medical guilds in London that use this specific design. I have sent a note to a colleague who will know. We should have an answer by morning. Watson nodded. He picked up the key again, turned it in his fingers. A cabinet somewhere. A specific lock, turned frequently by someone who carried this key on their person or inside a ledger they kept close. A cabinet that contained what? Records, perhaps. Vials with labels in a different hand. correspondence. The kind of evidence that a careful, intelligent man would want stored securely rather than destroyed, because careful, intelligent men frequently overestimated their own safety and kept things they should not have kept, for reasons that always seemed sufficient at the time. "There will be another attack," Holmes said quietly. It was not a question. Watson looked at him. "The operation is not concluded. The payment stopped, but the mechanism continues. The incidents continue to serve the purpose they were designed to serve. Until that purpose is fully achieved, or until something disrupts the arrangement, there will be more." He rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking down at the rainy street below. "We have perhaps 2 days, 3, if we are fortunate." The fire burned. The rain continued its patient work against the glass. The key sat on the table between the ledger and the lamp, small and plain and worn with use, pointing toward a lock neither of them had yet found. Watson thought of Whitechapel in the rain, of the fear that was living there, patient and well-fed, moving through the streets like the fog, not attached to any single person or place, simply present, looking for somewhere to settle. Holmes had said it. Fear, once fed, becomes a creature of its own. He was beginning to understand what that meant. The answer about the seal arrived before breakfast. It came in the form of a note, hand-delivered by a boy who knocked once and departed before Mrs. Hudson had fully opened the door, a method of communication that Holmes occasionally employed when he wished a message to travel quickly and without the formality of a postal record. The note was brief. Holmes read it at the table, standing, still in his dressing gown, with his tea untouched at his elbow, and the early morning light coming through the window in the thin, cautious manner of October light that was not yet certain of its welcome. He set the note down, picked up his tea, drank it. "Collegium Medicinae Practicum," he said, a small private medical society, founded in 1871, originally associated with the teaching hospitals of the East End. Membership was by invitation, physicians of a research inclination, primarily. It dissolved formally in 1884, or was believed to have dissolved. The premises were given up, the membership dispersed. He paused. The seal, however, continued in use, which means that someone considered themselves a continuing member of something that no longer officially existed. Watson looked up from his own breakfast. Vane. Vane was listed among the founding members, Holmes said. One of 6. The others are variously accounted for. Retired, deceased, practicing elsewhere. Vane is the only one still working in the East End. He sat down. And the only one, as far as my colleague can establish, who maintained any active research program after the Collegium's dissolution. Outside, Baker Street was conducting its morning with its usual purposeful noise. A barrel organ somewhere down the street was playing something Watson could not quite identify, but which had the cheerful, slightly desperate quality of a tune that knew it was being performed in cold weather and was trying to compensate. A news vendor at the corner was announcing his wares with the particular verbal economy of a man who had reduced complex events to 6 words or fewer. This morning's 6 words, Watson gathered from the portion he could hear through the window glass, involved Whitechapel and a word he could not quite make out, but which was probably either monster or terror, or one of the other dramatic nouns the newspapers had been cycling through since October began. Holmes was looking at the note again, not reading it. He had read it already, completely, in the way he read everything, which was once and entirely. But looking at it with the expression of someone checking the fit of a structure they had assembled, testing for the places where the joints did not quite hold. "Tell me about the physiology," he said, "in as much detail as is useful. What happens to a man, specifically, when animal blood is introduced into his system?" Watson set down his fork. This was, he recognized, the moment when the theory required his professional contribution, when Holmes's remarkable machinery of inference and deduction reached the edge of its territory and required the specific, practical knowledge of a physician to carry it further. It was one of the aspects of their partnership Watson valued most, the complementarity of it, the way their different kinds of knowing fitted together without overlap. "The immediate response depends on the quantity and the route of introduction," Watson said, "in the experiments I am aware of. Largely from French and German literature, the work has not been widely replicated in England. Small quantities, introduced, slowly produce a febrile response within hours. The temperature rises sharply. There is sweating, disorientation, occasionally delirium." He paused. "In larger quantities, or when combined with stimulant compounds that accelerate the blood circulation, the response is more severe. The immune response becomes overwhelming. The body mobilizes everything it has against the foreign material. The result is a state that resembles, in its outward presentation, extreme intoxication, but with a quality of physical strength and agitation that intoxication alone does not produce." Holmes was very still. "A man in that state," Watson continued carefully, "would appear profoundly abnormal to a witness. His movements would be uncoordinated, but forceful. His responses to stimulus, noise, light, physical contact, would be extreme and unpredictable. His facial expression, due to the muscular tension produced by the febrile state, would be distorted." He looked at the table. "And the eyes. The sclera, the whites, can, in severe febrile episodes involving certain compounds, take on a yellowish cast, the jaundice effect. It does not last. But in lamplight, to a frightened witness who was already expecting something inhuman—" "Yellow eyes," Holmes said quietly. "Yellow eyes," Watson said. The barrel organ outside finished its tune and began another. The news vendor continued his editorial summary of recent events. The fire in the grate burned with the steady, democratic warmth it brought to all conversations equally, regardless of their content. Watson thought of the man in the hospital, the trembling patient he had treated several weeks ago, whose case had seemed straightforward at the time. A laboring man, 30 or thereabouts, brought in by a woman who said he was her brother, and who had the expression of someone who had been frightened for some time and had become, through practice, very good at not showing it. The man had been febrile, sweating despite the cold of the room. His hands had not been able to keep still. A fine, persistent tremor that wasn't the tremor of cold or fear, but the tremor of a body working very hard at something. His eyes, in the gaslight of the examination room, had been. Watson had noted it, and moved past it, had attributed it to the light, had not examined the attribution too closely. He had treated the fever, had given the man something for the tremor, had recorded a diagnosis of acute febrile episode, cause undetermined, and had moved on to the next patient, because there were always more patients, and the cause undetermined category was, in a Whitechapel clinic, more heavily populated than anyone wished. He said this to Holmes. All of it. Without editing. Holmes listened in the same complete silence he always gave to Watson's observations, the silence of someone for whom listening was not a courtesy, but a method. When Watson had finished, Holmes said, "You could not have known." "No," Watson said, "but I knew something was wrong with the diagnosis, and I did not pursue it." "You pursued it as far as the evidence available to you permitted," Holmes said. Not kindly, exactly. Holmes's comfort was rarely kind in the conventional sense, but with the precision of a man making a true statement, rather than a consoling one, which Watson had always found more useful. "You are pursuing it now. That is what matters." Watson nodded once and let it go, or began the process of letting it go, which was, he acknowledged to himself, a different and longer thing. "The stimulant compounds," Holmes said, "in Vane's office. What were they, specifically?" "I couldn't identify them with certainty from the vials alone," Watson said. "But the preparation I mentioned, the colour, the size of the bottle, the particular opacity of the liquid, is consistent with a compound derived from ergot, combined with something to accelerate the cardiac rate. The combination would amplify the febrile response considerably, produce a state of agitation that would last several hours. Long enough." He paused, and then resolve. The body clears it, eventually. The man wakes the next morning remembering nothing, or very little, with shaking hands and no idea why he is wherever he woke. "In a police cell in Stepney," Holmes said. "In a police cell in Stepney." Holmes rose. He moved to the mantelpiece and stood with his back to the fire, in the attitude Watson recognized as the one he adopted when a case had reached the point of sufficient clarity to require action. Not the hunched, coiled stillness of deep thought, but the upright, forward quality of someone who had thought far enough and was now ready to move. "The mechanism," Holmes said, "is as follows. Vane identifies men, working men, men without resources or reliable advocates, men whose sudden violent behavior will be attributed to drink or madness without further inquiry. He administers the compound. He releases them into Whitechapel at times calculated to produce witnesses. The attacks that result are not entirely manufactured. The men are genuinely dangerous in that state. The harm done is real." A pause. "But the targeting is not theirs. The timing is not theirs. They are instruments. They do not know it, and they will not remember it." "And the wounds," Watson said. "In Dutfield's yard. They were too precise for a man in that state." "Yes." Holmes turned. "Because Dutfield's yard wasn't committed by one of Vane's instruments. Dutfield's yard was committed by Vane himself, or by someone with Vane's knowledge acting under his direct instruction. The earlier incidents, the ones in September, before the newspapers gave the story its current shape, those were the instruments. Dutfield's yard was the escalation. The moment when the manufactured panic needed to reach a new level." He paused. "The protection payments, Watson, they had stalled. Some of the neighborhood associations had begun to doubt. The fear was losing its force. It needed to be renewed." The ribbon was on the mantelpiece. Watson had moved it there the previous evening without particularly deciding to. It had simply seemed wrong to leave it on the table. It sat now between the clock and a small stack of Holmes's correspondence, its rust-red colour catching the firelight, its bow still carefully tied. Watson looked at it. "The ribbon," he said. "It was hers." "I believe so. She wasn't chosen randomly. She was known to someone involved in the operation. She was, I think, about to speak to someone she should not have spoken to. The ribbon was placed by someone who felt afterward the need to mark it. Not remorse, perhaps, but something. Holmes looked at the ribbon too for a moment. The human capacity for sentiment is not extinguished by moral failure. It merely coexists with it, uncomfortably. Watson stood. He felt the specific tiredness of a man who has been sitting with difficult knowledge and is now ready to carry it somewhere useful. "The key," he said. "The key," Holmes agreed. "There is a cabinet in Vane's office, or somewhere accessible to him, that holds whatever documentation he has kept of this operation. Records of the compounds, records of the men used, records of the payments. He kept them. As careful, intelligent. Men keep things because he believed himself safe, because he believed the operation was invisible." Holmes moved to the table and picked up the key, turning it once in his fingers before setting it in his waistcoat pocket, with the particular finality of a man placing a tool he intends to use shortly. He placed that ledger page in Dutfield's yard for a reason we have not yet fully established. But I suspect it was meant as a communication, to someone specific, perhaps a warning, perhaps a negotiation. He paused. Which means there are others involved, which means the operation is more fragile than it appears. And fragile things, Watson, when properly pressed. "Break," Watson said. "Break," Holmes agreed. "We go to the hospital again. Tomorrow, early. I will send word to Lestrade tonight. Not everything, not yet, but enough to ensure that when the moment comes, there is a legal framework available to receive what we bring." He reached for his coat. "The key will open a cabinet. The cabinet will contain the documentation. The documentation will complete the picture." Watson looked at the ribbon one more time. A careful bow, tied by careful fingers, sitting on a mantelpiece in Baker Street, where it had not been made and did not belong, waiting to go back to the world as something other than what it had been in the mud of Dutfield's yard. A clue, yes. But also, the word Holmes had used came back to him. A sentiment. An awkward, uncomfortable, entirely human one. He picked up his own coat. The morning outside was bright for October, the sun making its temporary and somewhat unconvincing argument against the season, and the barrel organ had moved on to a third tune, this one slightly more confident than the previous two. The case was not finished, but its shape was clear now, in the way that the city's rooftops were clear this morning against the October sky. Defined, legible, no longer approximate. Tomorrow, the key. Tonight, a letter to Lestrade. And somewhere in between, if Mrs. Hudson was agreeable, perhaps something with onions and stock again. Because Watson had learned, in a long career of difficult days, that the body required maintenance regardless of what the mind was doing, and that a man who had not eaten properly was a man who noticed things slightly less well than he should. Holmes, who had been making for the door, paused. "Watson," he said. "Yes." "The patient you treated, the man with the tremor." A pause. "If he can be found, and I believe he can, his testimony will matter. Not legally, necessarily, but it will matter." Watson looked at him. "It will matter," Holmes said again, quietly, "that someone asks him what happened to him, even if he cannot fully answer." He went through the door. Watson stood for a moment in the sitting room with the fire and the ribbon, and the particular silence of a room that has just held a difficult conversation and is settling back into itself. Then he followed. The hospital was quieter in the early morning than Watson had expected. He had been in enough hospitals at enough hours to know that they were never truly quiet. There was always something requiring attention somewhere, always a bell or a footstep or the low, particular sound of human difficulty, being managed by human effort in the rooms behind closed doors. But the London hospital at this hour had a specific quality of suspended motion, as though the institution had drawn a single long breath between the night's emergencies and the day's scheduled work, and was holding it, briefly, before exhaling into the ordinary business of keeping people alive. The fog had returned. It had been absent for 2 days, an unusual absence, as though it had somewhere else to be, and had returned in the night with the air of something that had never really left, merely stepped out briefly and was now resuming its habitual position against the windows and along the lower walls and in the spaces between the gas lamps that lined the hospital's entrance corridor. It softened the morning into something almost gentle. Almost. Holmes moved through the entrance without stopping at the porter's desk, which was occupied by a young man sufficiently absorbed in a newspaper to present no practical obstacle. Watson followed, matching Holmes's pace, not hurrying, not dawdling, moving with the specific confidence of 2 men who belonged exactly where they were, which was, in Watson's experience, the most effective way of appearing to belong anywhere. Lestrade was already inside. This was a small surprise. Watson had expected him to be late. Lestrade was, in Watson's extended observation, a man who arrived at the correct conclusion eventually, and at the correct location slightly after the time agreed upon. But here he was, in the lower corridor, outside the records room, in his overcoat and his expression of a man who had been told enough to come, and not quite enough to know what he was coming to. He had brought a constable, a large, quiet young man who stood against the wall with the relaxed attentiveness of someone trained to be present without intruding. "Mr. Holmes," Lestrade said, "your note was characteristically brief." "Brevity is a courtesy," Holmes said. "It leaves you room to form your own impressions rather than importing mine." He did not stop walking. "Come." Lestrade came, with the expression of a man who has been making this particular concession for years, and has reached a complicated peace with it. The lower corridor ran the length of the east wing, its floor scrubbed stone, its walls the particular shade of institutional cream that suggested a colour chosen not for its pleasantness, but for its practicality, a shade that cleaned well and communicated nothing. The doors along it were heavy, each with a small brass plate identifying the room behind. Research dispensary, records, staff common room, and at the far end, separated from the others by a stretch of blank wall that gave it a slight air of deliberate distance. Dr. C. Vane, Hematological Research. The door was closed. Light showed at its base, a thin, steady line of warm yellow that meant a lamp was burning inside. Holmes stopped before the door. He produced the key from his waistcoat pocket and held it for a moment without using it. Not hesitating, Watson thought, but marking the moment, in the way that Holmes occasionally marked moments that were about to become permanent. Then he tried the door handle. It was unlocked. He pushed it open and went in. Vane was there. He was not at his desk. He was standing at the far end of the room, beside the shelves Watson remembered from their first visit, the shelves with the vials, the journals, the notebooks stacked horizontally. He was wearing his coat, which suggested he had arrived recently or was preparing to leave. His hands were at his sides. He looked, Watson thought, less like a man who had been caught than like a man who had been waiting, with the expression of someone who has been anticipating a particular conversation for some time and has mixed feelings about its finally arriving. He looked at Holmes, then at Watson, then at Lestrade and the constable behind him, and something in his expression settled, not collapsed, not crumbled, but settled, in the manner of a structure accepting a load it had known was coming. "I wondered," Vane said, "whether it would be you." "It was always going to be someone," Holmes said. He moved into the room with his customary unhurried economy, his eyes making their circuit, the shelves, the desk, the cabinet against the left wall. A tall, dark wood cabinet, its door fitted with a brass lock, its surface clear of everything, except a single ring of dried residue where a cup had been set down many times in the same place. Eventually, it is always someone. Vane did not move from his position by the shelves. He watched Holmes cross the room with the expression of a chess player watching a piece advance that he had long since stopped being able to block. Watson stood near the door with Lestrade. The room smelled, as it had before, carbolic, paper, the faint, warm animal note beneath. Stronger now, Watson thought, or perhaps simply more legible, now that he knew what it was. Holmes stopped before the cabinet. He produced the key. He held it up, briefly, so that Vane could see it. Vane said nothing. Holmes inserted the key into the lock. It turned, smoothly, without resistance, with the particular ease of a mechanism used often and maintained well. The cabinet opened. Inside, 3 shelves. The upper shelf held a row of small brown bottles, each labelled in the cramped script Watson recognized as Vane's, each sealed with red wax. The middle shelf held a series of notebooks, 7, Watson counted, their spines marked with dates in the same hand. And the lower shelf held a stack of folded papers, tied, with a length of plain cord, with the particular neat compactness of documents someone had organized for purposes of future reference. Holmes did not touch anything immediately. He simply looked at the cabinet's contents with the expression of someone confirming an account they had already audited in their head. "The compounds are documented," Holmes said to Lestrade, without turning. "The notebooks will contain the experimental records, dates, quantities, subjects." A pause. I use the word subjects in the clinical sense, though the ethical application of that word is, I think, at some distance from what occurred here. Lestrade stepped forward. He looked at the cabinet with the expression of a man revising, in real time, the nature of the situation he had walked into. "Mr. Holmes," he said quietly. "What exactly?" "The men," Holmes said. He turned now and looked at Vane directly. Not with anger. Holmes's expressions under pressure were rarely anger. With the particular quality of a man delivering a verdict that has been a long time in preparation. The men you identified in Whitechapel. Working men. Men without advocates. You administered the compounds. You timed the releases. You arranged the attacks. A pause. So brief, it was barely a pause at all. And you arranged the protection payments. Through intermediaries. Persons in the neighborhood who believed they were operating independently, but whose clients and timing you controlled from here. He gestured at the cabinet. It is all here, I expect. You kept records. Careful men always keep records. Vane was quiet for a moment. The lamp on his desk burned steadily. The fog pressed against the window. "The research was legitimate," he said finally. His voice was even, not defensive, something more complicated than defensive. The voice of a man making a distinction he considered important. The physiological response to heterologous transfusion is genuinely not understood. The mechanisms of rejection, the febrile cascade, the neurological effects, there is real knowledge to be obtained. Knowledge that could eventually what? Watson said. He had not intended to speak. The words arrived before the decision to say them. Justify what you did to those men. They did not consent. They had no understanding of what was happening to them. They woke in police cells with no memory, and the records of what had been done to them were scribbled over, and they went back to their lives carrying something they could not name or account for. He stopped. The room was very quiet. There is no eventually that reaches far enough. Vane looked at him. The expression on his face was not, Watson was surprised to find, contempt. It was something more genuinely uncomfortable. The expression of a man who had told himself a story for a long time, and has just heard it described from outside, and cannot, in this specific moment, make the two versions fit together. He did not answer. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "The documentation in the cabinet is sufficient for an arrest, and for proceedings against Dr. Vane on charges I will enumerate for you in writing this afternoon. The compounds should be secured immediately. Some are unstable, and should be handled by someone who knows what they are looking at. Watson will advise your people." He paused. "The intermediaries in Whitechapel, the individuals who administered the protection arrangements, are a secondary matter and a separate set of proceedings. I have notes on 3 names, which I will also provide." Lestrade, who had been listening to all of this with the expression of a man drinking water faster than he could swallow it, nodded. He signalled to the constable. The constable moved to the cabinet with the careful, deliberate manner of someone who had been told to be careful, and was taking the instruction seriously. Vane, throughout all of this, stood beside his shelves. He did not resist. He did not argue. He watched the cabinet being secured with the expression of a man watching something end, not dramatically, not with the gestures of a concluded story, but with the flat, dull recognition of an ordinary ending arriving on an ordinary morning, which is, Watson had long since come to understand, how most endings actually arrived. Holmes moved to the desk. He picked up a small object Watson had not previously noticed, a ring, plain gold, sitting beside the lamp as though set down temporarily and not picked up again. He held it for a moment, then set it back. "Your seal ring," he said. "The Collegium Medicinae Practicum. You continued to use it after the society dissolved." A pause. "Why?" Vane looked at the ring. Something moved across his face, quickly, almost not there. "Because I still believed in what we had set out to do," he said. "When we founded it, before—" he stopped. "Before it became something else." Holmes said nothing. He looked at the ring for one more moment, and then looked away. Lestrade was organizing the constable and the contents of the cabinet with the efficient, slightly harried manner of a man who had arrived expecting one kind of morning and received another. He had, Watson thought, risen to the occasion with more grace than Watson had always credited him. There would be paperwork. There would be a great deal of paperwork and telephone calls and the involvement of persons at Scotland Yard with important titles and strong opinions about procedure. But the essential thing, the cabinet, the notebooks, the compounds, the man who had produced them, was secured. The essential thing was done. Watson moved toward the door, and then stopped. He turned back to the room, to the shelves, the desk, the open cabinet with its neatly organized evidence of a neatly organized wrong. To Vane, standing beside his life's work, which had been two things at once, and was now, definitively, only one. "The man I treated," Watson said. "Weeks ago. Febrile episode, tremor, cause undetermined. He is in the notebooks, I expect." Vane looked at him. "Page 43, he said quietly. "Third notebook from the left." Watson nodded. "He should be told. What happened to him? As much as can be explained without... He should be told." Vane said nothing, but he did not look away. In the corridor outside, Lestrade was already organizing the formal proceedings, with the decisive energy of a man who had found his footing and intended to use it. Holmes had drifted into the corridor too, and Watson could hear them exchanging the practical particulars. Who would be informed? In what order? With what degree of preliminary explanation? Watson remained in the doorway for a moment. He looked at the ring beside the lamp, at the cabinet with its open door, at the window through which the fog was doing its patient, indifferent work on the morning outside. Then he heard, faint and distant and entirely incongruous, a sound from further along the corridor, the sound of someone laughing, not Lestrade. The young constable, apparently, had said something that had struck a colleague as funny, and the resulting laughter was brief and genuine and completely at odds with the gravity of the corridor and the room and the morning's specific weight. It was, Watson thought, the most ordinary sound imaginable. He was glad of it. He went out into the corridor and pulled the door of Vane's office close behind him, not locked, not sealed, simply closed, and joined Holmes, who was listening to Lestrade with the patient expression of a man who has won the argument and is now content to let the other person explain what he has won. "Mr. Holmes," Lestrade was saying, with the particular quality of a man composing his narrative for a future audience, "I had, of course, been developing a theory along similar lines." "Of course you had, Lestrade," Holmes said. "Shall we find some tea?" They took a cab back to Baker Street. It was not a decision so much as a natural conclusion. The morning had reached that point where the work was done, and the body knew it, and the body's considered opinion was that Baker Street was the correct direction. Holmes sat with his coat collar turned up and his eyes on the passing street, saying nothing. Watson sat beside him, and also said nothing, and the silence between them was the particular comfortable silence of two people who have been through something together and do not need to describe it to each other. London moved past the cab windows in its ordinary fashion. A woman at a corner selling hot chestnuts from a brazier, the smoke rising in a thin, pale column. A boy delivering newspapers with the efficient indifference of someone for whom the news was purely logistical. Two clerks walking rapidly side by side, their conversation animated, their breath visible in the cold air. All of it utterly unremarkable. All of it, this morning, quietly beautiful. Mrs. Hudson had, somehow, anticipated them. The fire was built up. The tea was fresh. There was toast and something in a covered dish that turned out to be kedgeree, which Watson consumed with the focused gratitude of a man who had earned it. Holmes ate less than Watson thought he should, which was usual, and sat afterward with his cup, and looked at the fire with the particular settled expression of a concluded case. Watson poured a second cup. Outside, the fog continued its slow withdrawal from the city, and the morning light strengthened by degrees, and the barrel organ was back on its corner, and everything was as it had been, and as it would continue to be. "The fear will not end immediately," Holmes said, after a while. Watson looked at him. "Vane is taken. The operation is finished. The compounds are secured." Holmes turned his cup slowly in his hands. "But the city has been living with a shape for several weeks now. The shape does not disappear because the man who drew it is in custody. It persists in the people who saw it, or believed they saw it, in the women who did not walk certain streets after dark, in the men who checked their locks an extra time." A pause. "Fear, once fed, becomes its own creature. It doesn't require the original source to continue living." Watson considered this. "But it diminishes," he said, "over time. Without feeding, it diminishes." "Yes," Holmes said, "over time." He looked back at the fire. "That is the best one can honestly say." Watson thought of Whitechapel in the weeks ahead. The gradual, unannounced process by which a frightened neighbourhood returned to itself. Not all at once, not with any ceremony, but slowly. The way colour returns to something that has been held too long in shadow. The women who would, eventually, walk certain streets again. The men who would stop checking the locks the extra time. The lodging houses and the market stalls resuming their ordinary economies of risk and management, no longer inflated by the specific tax of manufactured terror. It would take time. Holmes was right about that. But it would happen, because it always happened, because people were. And here Watson found himself thinking of something Holmes had said weeks ago about the human capacity for sentiment persisting alongside moral failure, because people were more resilient than the things done to them. Not always, not without cost, but more often than not. He looked at the mantelpiece. The ribbon was still there, rust-red, carefully tied, its bow holding its shape with the stubborn persistence of a knot made by patient hands. It had been an anomaly in the mud of Dutfield's yard, and a clue on the table in Baker Street, and a presence on this mantelpiece through the whole of the case. Moving, as Holmes had said, the best objects moved, from meaningless to meaningful, and back toward something else. Not meaningless again, but settled, at rest. Watson stood and lifted it carefully, held it for a moment. "What will you do with it?" Holmes asked. He had not looked up from the fire. "I thought," Watson said, "that it should be returned to her family, if there is family, to the church that will bury her, if there is not." He paused. "It was hers. It should go back to the world as hers." Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then, "Yes, that is right." Watson set the ribbon on the small table by the door, where he kept things he intended to take with him when he left. The ledger page was all ready with Lestrade, as evidence. The key, Holmes had left it in the cabinet lock, which Watson thought was exactly correct. A key returned to the thing it opened, its work done, its carried life concluded. The cracked seal on the ledger's cover would be part of the formal record now. Evidence, exhibit. A broken circle in a legal document somewhere, carrying the weight of what it had authorized without knowing. Objects, Watson thought. Accumulated meaning the way harbour walls accumulated. Barnacles, slowly, persistently, without particularly intending to. The ribbon had not intended to mean anything. It had simply been carried somewhere, and left, and found. And in the finding, it had become part of a story that was larger than itself, as objects always were. Holmes set down his cup. "The patient," he said. "Page 43. "I will find him," Watson said, "when this has settled a little, when he's had some distance from it." He paused. "Someone should ask him what happened to him." "Yes," Holmes said simply. The clock on the mantelpiece measured the last of the morning's silence. The fire burned. The barrel organ outside finished one tune and began, without pause, another. Something Watson recognized this time. A simple melody, unhurried, with the quality of a song that knew it did not need to do very much to be enough. Baker Street received the day in its usual fashion, unhurried, warm, slightly outside the ordinary rhythm of things, like a man reading at a window while the city moves below. Holmes reached for a book. Watson reached for his journal. Outside, London went about its life. The fog had gone. The morning was clear and cold and entirely ordinary, which was, on this particular morning, exactly what it needed to be. Watson wrote for a long time that evening. Not about the case. He had notes enough for the case, and would assemble them properly when the distance was sufficient. He wrote about the ribbon, about the bow, and the fingers that had tied it, and the small human insistence of a careful thing surviving an uncaring night. He did not have a conclusion for it. He left the page unfinished, which was, he thought, the most honest thing he could do. The ribbon left Baker Street the following morning. Where it went after that, Watson did not record. Some things, he had learned, were better carried than explained.